Alright, let's begin. My name is Joel, and today we're going to play with particle systems and sprite masks to create a really cool splatter paint effect where we can click and make paint explosions and then rain them down over a 2D terrain and create this cool paint effect. This is really super cool if you want to have blood effects or paint splatter or whatever you want. Whenever an enemy dies, you can have cool stuff that messes with your visuals and makes them kind of messy and persistent. It's kind of nice. So this particular tutorial, I'm going to do a little bit differently than my last ones. I have all the code pre-written, and I'm going to go over them step by step, and we're going to look at how you create this, but this is going to be significantly less code heavy than my last one. So to start, I'm actually just going to create a brand new scene. New scene. We will save that. And we're just going to save this. Save scene as in my scenes, and we're just going to call this Splat. Okay, we're going to start totally fresh. What we're going to be using in this tutorial is 3 scripts. A raycaster script that is going to shoot rays into our screen and return information about what we've clicked on. A splat script, which is just going to be the sprite that is a decal that we just paste onto the screen, and splat particles, which is going to be attached to our particle system that tells the game what the particles have collided with. We're also going to be using some colorful, fun splats that I have found on the internet. I will include in the description of the video where I got these particular ones, but you can use any kind of splats you want. These are just the ones that I happen to have found. We're also going to be using a square, which is very simple. In order to make a flat square shape, you just go right-click, create, sprite, square, and there you see I've created a couple of squares here. These are just a white square. This is going to be for our ground, for our foreground. We're also using it for the background and for the sprite and mask. So let's begin with creating our scene. We're going to start with an empty, I'm going to call this ground objects. This is just going to be a container, which we're going to zero out. We don't like things just wandering off into nowhere. All of our ground pieces and our background is going to go in here. So we're going to create a 2D object, sprite, and we're going to use one of these squares for it, so we just have a simple square. I'm going to call this ground. So what do we need for the ground? We need a collider to collide with, so box collider 2D. We're going to need a sprite mask, which is also going to use the square. The sprite mask is what's going to clip off the extra pieces, anything that's not inside of this box. We don't want to have pieces of paint floating in the air, so this is going to clip that off, which we'll demonstrate here very shortly. So let's move this down to the bottom, and then I'm going to hold Alt. I'm going to click drag and then hold Alt to widen that out. And we're going to take a look at that, see if that looks pretty good. Yeah, that's pretty good. I'm actually going to make it a little bit taller so we can see more of the paint hitting it. Let me paint on it. Yeah, okay, like that, pretty good. All right, so that is going to be our ground layer. We're going to make sure that the order in layer is set to 2 so it appears in front of other layers. And then the other background, or the other ground layer, which isn't technically ground, but we're going to keep it in the ground objects, is another 2D object sprite, and we're going to call this BG for background. We're going to use the same exact square, and we're going to have this be a bit tinted downward. In fact, I'm actually going to make both of these tinted downward a little bit, because that's a bit blinding to have it be pure white. We'll have it be a light gray. And the background will be a dark gray, just like that. And we're going to take our background, which is going to be set to -1 in the order in the layer, so it is certainly behind. And we're going to once again click this, drag, hold Alt, and just fill the space so we have a nice gray background. And I think I'm going to make that even a little bit darker still. I'm liking that. That looks pretty good. Okay, so the background needs also a collider, box collider 2D, but this one needs to be a trigger because we don't want things to be bouncing off of this collider on the background. This is only there so that when we click, our raycast can collide with that. And there's another important step on the ground. This needs to be set to a ground layer. Now, if there isn't one already in your layers list, which if you're opening up a new scene there will not be, we'll just go to add layer, type in ground, and then come back to the ground layer, and then just set that to ground. When we set up our particle system, we want it to be bouncing off of this only. One more important step. The background must have a BG tag, or whatever you want to name it. Once again, just go to Add Tags, and hit the little plus button here and type in BG or background or whatever you want to call it, and make sure that the background has that tag, because when we're checking to see what we've clicked on, we want to make sure that it's the background. We could have also used a layer for this, but we're going to use the tag for the background and the layer for the ground, because the particle system uses layers, and it's really easy to check the tag in code when we do our raycast. So those are the two base pieces for the ground. We're also going to create an empty called Splat holder. This is for hierarchy cleanliness. When we're spawning all these paint splats everywhere, I don't want them to just sort of spam up my hierarchy. I'm going to parent them to this object, and it's literally just going to be a holder, which is why I called it that. Next, we need to create a splat, our image. So let's make a new create 2D sprite, and I'm going to just drop this one in there as a placeholder so I can see where it is. We'll be changing these randomly in just a moment. I'm going to call this Splat Sprite. Yeah, let's just call it that. So all this really needs is a Splat script. We're going to go over the scripts directly here in just a moment. And we could start with, let's start with the Splat script, actually. That's a good place to start. So all this is information about the size, the rotation, the coloration, and the location of one of these splat images. So we have a color here called background tint, meaning if we want the background splats to be darker than the foreground splats, which I think is very important to differentiate them visually, we'll have a color saved for that. We have some floats for minimum size mod and maximum size mod, these basically being just a range of numbers for when we randomize the size. We have a set of sprites, all the sprites that we're going to randomize between, and we have a splat location enumeration to differentiate between whether they are foreground splats or background splats, because different things need to be on in those cases. And of course we have a private reference to our sprite renderer just to get access to it so we can set the sprite. And in Awake we do exactly that. We grab the reference to the sprite renderer just to have it there. Initialize is where we're going to give it information about what splat this is going to be. We're going to send in a splat location. We're going to set our local splat location to whatever we send in, and we're going to set the size, the sprite, the size, and the rotation of the sprite, and we're also going to give it some special information based on which one it's in. In set sprite, very simple, random int between 0 and the total sprites, and we're going to set our renderer to the sprite that has been selected. All this does is randomize. Size, very similar, a random range between min and maximum size modification. Then our transform.local scale will be multiplied by that modification to give it some variance. And the same thing once again with rotation. We'll get a random rotation between -360 and 360 and set our rotation to quaternion.Euler, pass in 0 for the x and the y, and the random rotation for the z because we're in 2D. If you were doing this in 3D and you wanted it to be on the ground, you'd want to pass that in for the y, but for the 2D, you want it on the z. And then lastly, the location properties. If we are on the background, we want to set our background color, our sprite renderer.color, to our background tint. And we also want to make sure that the sorting order is 0, so that our background splats do not overwrite our foreground splats or any other things that might be in the foreground. And if it is the foreground, this is the mask part. We want our sprite renderer's mask interaction to be visible inside mask, and I'm going to visually demonstrate that for you in just one moment. And we want the sorting order to be 3. Let's go take a look at what that actually means. So we have our sprite splat right here, right? And we can move this around and it's just going to dip behind the background there because right now it's set to order and layer of 0. Let's set that to 3 so it appears in front of everything. So there we go. Our background, I believe, is on -1. Background's on -1, ground's on 2, so the splat's on 3, which means it's going to be in front of everything. So right now the mask interaction is none. So it just doesn't interact with masks at all. If I bring it down here to the foreground and I set this mask interaction to visible inside, this sprite will only be visible inside the bounds of a sprite mask. So if we go back to our ground, we can take a look at our sprite mask right here, and we can see that it is this shape. So if I take my splat splat and I move it out, it's going to disappear, which is very useful if we get a splat that hits the edge of a surface. We don't want to see it hanging off the edge. So that is exactly what that does. This default I'm going to set back to none. While we're here, we need this sprite splat to be a prefab because we're going to be instantiating it when we hit stuff. So we're going to go into my splats prefabs folder here, see if I got some ones that I made from before when I was testing this, and we're going to drag that in here, splat sprite. And now we don't need it in the scene anymore. We can get rid of that. So, what is next? Next, we are going to start raycasting at this screen. Oh, before that, very important step, let's make a particle system. Effects, particle system. So when you create a particle system, you just get this default lovely white base sphere situation here. We're going to modify this a whole bunch. First of all, I don't need it to last 5 seconds. Let's add on 2 seconds. Let's set the lifetime, excuse me, mouse bump there. The lifetime between 2 and 3 seconds, let's say. Start speed, let's set that between, once again, between 2 constants, between 3 and 5. Seems like a good start. We will be needing gravity, so let's take the gravity modifier to 1. So they create a little waterfall for us. We will want this to be in world space, so that when we drag this around, they fall kind of in a natural way. And we will need collisions, of course. So let's turn on the collisions module and set this to the world, 2D, because we want to bounce off 2 things. Now you notice immediately we get some weird behavior here. Why are we getting weird behavior? Well, because it's bouncing off the background. So let's set the collision to collides with. First we'll select nothing to get rid of all of it, and then we'll select the ground in particular. So now you see they're only bouncing off the ground layer. Other important things, we need send collision messages to be checked, because when we check in code to see what we bounced off of, this needs to be on. Finally, we want our particles to actually die when they hit something. We don't want them to actually bounce off, although you could have them bounce off and then hit again and create additional splats. But for this tutorial, we don't want that to happen. So our maximum kill speed, we're going to just set that to 0. So that when a collision occurs, if the speed is 0 or higher, it will kill the particle, which is obviously what we want. And we don't need the bounce at all, so we'll set that to 0 once again. Now we're getting kind of this, they fall, they hit the surface and they disappear, which is exactly what we want. Other important factors. Let's come down to our renderer and make sure that we have our order set to 3. We want to make sure that our particles aren't like hidden behind the background accidentally. So we'll just go ahead and set those to 3 right in advance. And lastly, well, not lastly, but next we want this to be a stretched billboard, which is looking a little bit weird because we haven't set the sizes yet, but this makes them a more drop-like shape. Let's go set our sizes. Start size. Those are way too big. Random between 2 constants. Let's set this to be between 0.2 and 0.5. That's a little bit better. Now they're kind of like droplets. And obviously I'm using the default particle here. If you have your own custom texture or material and you want to have actual little droplets, that would look a lot better, but we're just going to use the default one for the tutorial. So it's looking pretty close to what I wanted to do. Let's go ahead and change the color though. Random between 2 colors, and we'll give it a bright red and a dark red to give this sort of a red paint blood look going on. Okay, that's looking pretty alright. I'm happy with that. So we have our emission. Oh, actually, you know what? That's a good point. Let's talk about emission. This is a constant stream. Let's not do that. Let's have that be 0. And we'll create a burst. So now we have this all at once blast of particles. The 30 is a little too many. Let's set that to 15. And I don't really like how uniform that is, so let's change the speed variation a bit more. So let's start speed between 1 and 8. There we go. See, it's a bit more of an explosion now. They have different speeds, different sizes. I like that. So this is our actual particle explosion. Our particle explosion does not need to loop, and it does not need to play on a wake, because this is going to happen when we click. We're going to click on the screen, we're going to move this particle system, which let's name this Splat Particles. We're going to move this to the location that we click, and we're going to tell it to play once. And the last thing we need is actually the Splat Particles script, which we're going to go over next. So this thing, let's go over these variables first. This is very short. All this needs is a particle system, which is going to be the very same particle system that it is attached to. It needs a game object, the Splat prefab, which is our image that we're going to be painting onto the scene. It needs a Splat holder transform, which, like I mentioned earlier, is nothing other than house cleaning. It makes sure that our hierarchy doesn't get cluttered with lots of objects. And this is the important part here, particle collision event list. So this is going to contain a list of all the particle collision events that this particle system happens with, right? So down here in onParticleCollision, which is a built-in Unity method that takes in a game object, We're just going to call it other to represent whatever the other thing we collided with is. And the first thing we do is we get collision events. And this thing wants a particle system, so we give it the one we've got. It wants what it's collided with, which is the other thing. And it wants a list of collision events, which we've already created up here. And it's going to populate that list with whatever the events are. So then what we're going to do is we're going to go through that list. We're going to iterate across all of it and do some stuff every time we have one. So this is me pre-caching the count instead of, like, a lot of people would do 4 and then they would just drop in this right here, but I just keep the cache. It's a little bit more efficient to do this. So inside this, for every event, collision event, we're going to create a splat, which means we're going to instantiate our splat prefab and we're going to put it at the collision event at I dot intersection. This is the point at which it actually collides. And we'll just set its rotation to quaternion.identity, which is no rotation. Then we're going to take that splat, we're going to transform.setParent to the splat holder. This is for cleanliness sake, just so our hierarchy doesn't get messed up. And this true is going to fix the, when you do set parent, sometimes you can have slight oddities. And if you do, and you set that set parent world position stays to true, it will make sure that it doesn't alter the position of its actual location. Which means when we instantiate it into the world at this location, it'll still be there, it won't be offset. Then we're going to grab our splat script, which is just a get component on the splat prefab we just instantiated, and tell it to initialize and then pass in foreground. Because remember, when these particles collide with something, they can only collide with the ground layer. And the only thing that we have in the scene that is a ground layer is our foreground piece, so we want to tell the splat to initialize on the foreground. This, we're going to go ahead and set that up. So splat particles, we need some particles, that's literally these particles. We need a prefab, so let's go to prefab and grab our splat sprite that we just made. And we need a holder, which is just this thing here. That's all we need for that. The last step is the raycasting, which is going to be a script called raycaster. So let's take a look at it. Very simple once again. The raycaster needs some particles, which is going to be our particle system, because it's going to move them to the position that we click. It needs a splat prefab game object, which is just the splat sprite we're going to be pasting into the world. And it needs a splat holder for the same reason of hierarchical cleanliness. So in our update, we're just going to check to see if the mouse button down 0, this is left click, is pressed, and if so, we're going to cast array. Our cast array method, very simple. We're going to get array from camera.main.screen.point2ray, and we're going to pass in the input.mouse position. This is going to cast array through our screen from the camera into the screen itself. And then we're going to get a raycast hit2d object called a hit, which is physics2d.raycast intersection. We're going to give it the ray, and we're going to give it an infinite range, because we're just going to raycast until we hit something or nothing. And this raycast intersection is important because normally in 2D raycasting you can't cast depth-wise, you can't cast into the screen. So this is an interesting method that comes with Unity that lets you cast into the screen for 2D purposes for exactly what we need here. Then we're going to check to see if we hit something. So if the hit.collider is not null, we hit something. We're going to create a splat at that location. So we're going to instantiate our splat prefab at the hit.point and no rotation. We're going to grab that splat's transform. We're going to set its parent just like we did in the particles, so it's in the splat holder. We're going to grab the splat script because we're going to need to initialize it in a moment. And then before that, we're actually going to spray some particles out. So the splat particles are going to play, the splat image is going to be created, and all of it's going to come together to create this effect. So we move our splat particles to our hit.point, wherever we've clicked, and we tell it to play. That's just going to play at one time. Then we're going to check to see if the collider that we've hit is the background tag. This is why we made that background tag earlier, and if it is, we'll initialize it on the background, and if it's not, which means we click the foreground, we're going to initialize it on the foreground. So let's go back and make sure we hook all this stuff up. Okay, so let's go to our main camera and add in our raycaster. We need some splat particles, which we have right here. We need our splat prefab, which we have right here. And actually, this is a good point. I actually forgot to add our splat script to our splat particles. Let's go drag that out real quick. So this obviously wouldn't be able to change its splat sprite or be background tinted or any of these things if we had forgotten to add that, so it's important that we catch that little error there. Let's make our tint color kind of a darker gray. We don't want it to be fully visible. And for the sprites, we can click the little lock button up here, and then go to our splats, hold shift and select all of them, and we can just drag them on top of the sprites like that. That would be for our splat sprite. We'll apply that, and we'll kill this. Don't need that in the scene. So back to our main camera, we need that prefab now that we've made sure that it's not going to break on us. Put that there, and we need a splat holder, which is this one right here. So let's give it a try. And we click, we get explosions, we get paint covering everything. Looks pretty cool. Nice. All right, that'll do it for this one. Hopefully it was useful to you, and we'll see you next time.